the civil rights era in the US, black folks are standing up, demanding equal rights and to state-sponsored racism. And, that seems to be like a very powerful movement. And then, boom, Martin Luther King is assassinated in 1968. And then folks start asking themselves, well, all this time I've been listening to what Martin had to say and I've been protesting nonviolently, but if Martin is gunned down in the streets, then is that really a viable option anymore? Is there a point to, maybe we need to ramp up our activism and take it to the next level? So then we see in the late 60s, after MLK is assassinated, we see some of his supporters, people who worked with him, like this man James Foreman, again, ramping it up a notch and getting radicalized and starting to speak about something that today on the left we would consider a mainstream demand, but then it was considered super radical, talking about reparations for black folks in the United States for centuries of slavery. So James Foreman issues this manifesto calling for a manifesto to the white Christian churches and Jewish synagogues in the US and all other racist institutions. And what does he want? He decides that he's going to make a march on the richest church in New York City. This is the Riverside Church, and he's going to say, pay up. It's time for you guys to come clean and set the record straight. And so he demands of them to pay him $500 million, as restitution for slavery and how they benefited from it. So how did they respond? Well, $500 million is a lot of money, but they actually stepped up and offered him $500,000, and he accepted it. And he's okay. They listened to what he had to say, and they felt it was legitimate, so they were able to come to an agreement. Great. Now that that worked out, he decides a couple weeks later he's going to do the same thing, but with the richest Jewish synagogue in New York City, Temple Emmanuel, Manhattan. And sure enough, announces his intentions to go up there, and at least according to the historical record, people in the synagogue said that they stated their willingness to hear him speak and to listen to his arguments. So this is when Kahana implements the second plank of his platform, Anti-Blackness, and he decides he's going to confront James Foreman. He's not going to allow this to pass, and so he gets together a group of young Jewish men, and according to Time magazine, 30 members arrived at Temple Emmanuel with clubs and chains. And Kahana went on the record saying, quote, if he shows up, we'll break both his legs. Why? Well, there is no reason why Jews should give in to this extortion. Extortion, yes. According to Kahana, he said, there were no Jewish slave owners. We owe him nothing. Now, I'm not going to go too deep into this. If you're interested in what actually went down, I urge you to watch my previous lecture, Judea, Africa, America, where I go into great detail about it. But just very briefly, this is the exact opposite of what occurred. According to Bertram Korn and many others, and this is an esteemed rabbi and a chaplain in the US Army and an author of many books, including Jews and Negro Slavery in the Old South, he documented it, and what he said, according to Bertram Korn, quote, any Jew who could afford to own slaves and had need for their services would do so in the American South. So, at least from my research, there's no evidence to suggest, on one hand, that Jews participated more than their Christian neighbors in the slave trade, but at the same time, there's absolutely no evidence to suggest that they participated any less than their Christian neighbors. If they could, they did. So there is a lot to account for. Maybe Kahana's own ancestors had only recently arrived in the US after the Civil War, but the Jewish community of America also had a debt to pay. And of course, Kahana wouldn't hear it. So he launches his anti-black campaign, and what this means in practice is, on the East Coast, they were incensed by the idea of black teachers in the school system, so they protested that. On the West Coast, they actually protested against black students being bused into the same schools as Jewish youth. So, on one, they took the Black Panthers, who, in the wake of the assassination of Martin Luther King, we have the black community ramping up its own activism, as I said, and we have militant groups like the Black Panthers patrolling black neighborhoods in New York City and other cities across the United States, starting in Oakland, California. So, on one hand, Kahana says of the Black Panthers, oh, they're goose-stepping Nazis, But on the other hand, he adopts their whole manners, and their whole idea of patrolling the neighborhood, and he takes their berets, and then he, starts these Jewish patrols where they would patrol neighborhoods of New York City with these same berets, and the idea here was, to confront anyone that they felt was a threat to their community. Now, at this point, and when I say confront, I mean with baseball bats and machetes, right? And duked it out in the streets. Now, some people may recall living in the US at that time, and they'll take issue with this, and they'll say, come on, David, is that really fair? Is it fair to put all this on anti-blackness, on anti-black racism? I mean, at that time, not only New York City, but in general, there was a massive amount of urban blight, specifically in New York, but also in other American cities. And if you were a person who was able to, then maybe you would have moved out into the suburbs, white flight, where you wouldn't have all the problems of the inner city. But that left behind elderly Jews and working class Jews who didn't have the same means to move out to the suburbs. And so now you're in a situation where there's lots of street crime. So wasn't Kahana just fighting crime? Wasn't he just defending old and impoverished Jews? How dare you assert that that's because of racism? Okay, I hear that. But if that's true, then why did he make, common cause in the Italian community? Because, this is Kahana, arm in arm with Joe Colombo, the head of the Italian mafia in New York City. And I guarantee you, as much as Jews were living in the same neighborhoods as black folks, they were living in the exact same neighborhoods as Italian folks, right? So when it came to black people, then they had to be confronted, with fisticuffs and with weaponry. But when it was white people who were being confronted by in the streets, then he doesn't make war with them, he makes peace with them, And it wasn't just that they, protested together, they played golf together. When Colombo was assassinated, Kahana was the only non-Italian allowed into the hospital room. So they were really tight. And, that's because the, Italians were racialized as white in the American context, at least at that time, and because, the community generally voted for the right, whereas black community obviously is a black population, and they generally voted left, so liberal. So that's, this accounts for the disparity, okay? It wasn't about crime, it was about color. And at that time, because the mayor of New York City actually enjoyed a lot of support from the African-American community, he was very well loved. New York City was probably the only city that didn't burn, that didn't go up in flames after Martin Luther King was assassinated, because John Lindsay walked through the streets of Harlem and showed the people that he was of them, and that he also was horrified by the assassination. So it was like, the only American city that didn't go, but because he enjoyed that support, and because he supported black political aspirations, the Kahanists hated him. Everywhere Lindsay went, they would harass him and harangue him and make his life hell, and he would have to duck out the back door, from speaking engagements, to the point where, on the eve of his re-election, he actually had to bring Golda Meir, former prime minister of Israel, at that time prime minister, he brings her into New York City to give her the keys to the city, hoping that might save him, that might sway some of the Jewish voters that he had already lost because of this constant harassment from Kahana and the Jewish Defense League.